Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I'm your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Wicked, specifically Glinda, her pathology slash psychology, and the way it kind of influences her choices. This episode focuses solely on the movie and stage production. I have not read any of the novels, so there may be some inconsistencies there. That said, I do have an episode planned on Fiero, and in case you missed it, Elphaba's video is up and thriving on the podcast channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or on YouTube, so you can go ahead and give that a watch as well to help tide you over until it's Fiero's turn to have some of the spotlight. And just as I did with Elphaba, I would like to start by discussing Glinda's childhood. We don't see as much of it as Elphaba's, but the short scene that we do get gives us a good bit of context that I think is worth noting. To be specific, I'm talking about the scene with little baby Glinda and her birthday party where she's gotten just about every present she's wanted, including a magic wand. She just still can't do magic, which is what she wants more than anything. She wants to do magic. She's upset by this, as any child would be, but her mother intervenes and says that as long as everybody loves Glinda, there's nothing to be sad about. And the scene is not in the original stage production, in case you aren't familiar with the stage production, and was included for the movie by John M. Chu. Now, the importance of this scene is that it establishes a couple of key traits regarding Glinda's pathology and her personality. Very clearly, it was instilled in her at a very young age that her worth and self-image is very dependent on whether or not people like her. Obviously, this impacts Glinda's later decisions, and having had this mindset instilled in her at a very young age, it becomes a core part of her person, as most things do when you're developing as a child. And this consequently leads to a lot of people-pleasing behaviors. Now, when I say, quote, people-pleaser, I want to state that I'm talking about a very specific type of people-pleaser. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. I myself tend to be a people-pleaser. I want to make others happy. I like doing that, and it makes me happy to be friendly, kind, and helpful. But at the same time, you have to set boundaries and things like that. People pleasers aren't inherently manipulative individuals, at least not that they know of. But again, it's kind of a gray area. So when I say that Glinda is a people pleaser, it may not be the type of people pleaser that you are familiar with. So take that into consideration. It's important to note that Glinda doesn't really have boundaries, like, at all, and she has some very specific traits and characteristics surrounding her people-pleasing behavior, namely that she is incredibly insecure. She doesn't present that way to the general public, but it's clear that her identity is centered solely on the acceptance of other people. And what's important to note is that regardless of motivation, a lot of people pleasers have an innate fear of rejection, which stems a lot from insecurity. They don't feel like they have anything to offer to the outside world or to anybody else outside of what they can do for other people, which is really sad when you think about it and you kind of break it down. People pleasers overall have a very deep desire to be well liked regardless of the outcome. There's also a very big fear of abandonment that can accompany people pleasing. That basically, if you stop making other people happy, they will leave you alone because you no longer provide for them and you're not worth their time. There's also a fear that when you fail to please somebody, there will be some type of punishment or unfavorable consequence. These will be important factors in Glinda's behavior, and other common behaviors can include, quote, going with the flow, a term a lot of people are familiar with, even if it contradicts their own deeply held personal beliefs. They rarely say no to people, and they can oftentimes make excuses for the faults of others. On top of this, people pleasers can lack self-awareness outside of their role as a people pleaser. And before we jump in on the impact this has on Glinda's decisions and behaviors, I also want to examine the grooming issue within Wicked, namely with Madame Morrible and the Wizard. how they groomed Glinda to be a mouthpiece for their political campaign. And I forgot to mention it in Elphaba's episode, but she was groomed as well by Madame Morrible into being an unwilling participant with the flying monkeys. The wizard was part of that as well. So I wanted to make it very clear that both Elphaba and Glinda were groomed by Madame Morrible and the wizard. So how does grooming work and why is it effective? First of all, grooming can be sexually motivated or non sexually motivated. In this case, it's non sexually motivated, but grooming is most commonly known with like sexual predators. That's what people are most familiar with. I just want to make it clear that's not the case in this situation. Grooming is the process of manipulation and abuse, which can stem from what sometimes is initially like an innocent relationship, and it's often with an adult or authority figure. The general aim or purpose of grooming is to manipulate a specific individual to gain power and control. This individual becomes their target. This is done exclusively for the groomer's benefit. The victim doesn't really get anything out of it at all. And a groomer will rely on a number of tactics to achieve their goal. Some of those tactics being using flattery. This is done with Elphaba. This is also done with Glinda, where Madame Morrible flatters Elphaba. You're the strongest witch that I've ever seen. I've been waiting years for somebody like you to be here. And then, the wizard making Elphaba and Glinda, seem like, oh, you guys can pick the color for the yellow brick road because it wasn't the yellow brick road at the time. Like giving them a sense of purpose, flattering them, making them feel way more important than they probably actually are. Groomers also exploit the target's vulnerabilities, including low self-esteem or financial challenges. Again, this applies to both Glinda and Elphaba. Specifically, Elphaba and Glinda's own respective insecurities and low self-esteem. Madame Morrible and the wizard know that Elphaba is insecure about her powers. She's insecure about her looks. She's insecure about her family dynamic. She wants to belong. So they weaponize that and say, hey, like, I want to be a family man. You guys, like, everybody's a child to me. You can be part of this family. Like, you can be the wizard's right-hand man. It's very targeted towards Elphaba. For Glinda, they know that she is a people pleaser. She wants everybody to like her. That's where her self-worth comes from. So they're going to weaponize and abuse that desire by giving her, oh, look, the people love you. They want you to be the face of Oz, giving her what she's wanted for so long, even promising in for good to have Elphaba be redeemed, that she can come stay with Glinda because Glinda doesn't have any real friends outside of Elphaba. So again, exploiting the target's vulnerabilities or financial challenges. In this case, both Elphaba and Glinda are pretty well off, so I wouldn't really say there's a lot of a financial dynamic there. Groomers also work on isolating the target from family and friends. Glinda being isolated from Elphaba and Fiero, from her family, and even still being kind of isolated from the general public outside of what Madame Morrible and the wizard will allow. They basically use Glinda's time to constantly promote the wizard. Like, she really doesn't have any social connections. This wasn't really a thing with Elphaba. They kind of reversed it, where instead of isolating her, she was exposed to more opportunities for social interaction. Another thing that groomers do, buy the target or victim gifts that they can't afford. In this, we can see Glinda getting a wand from Madame Morrible, getting, her floating bubble contraption. She has this whole private suite in place to stay. Her wedding is completely funded. I mean, they're throwing gifts and money at her left and right. In the case of Elphaba, the gift for her was getting the private classes, being allowed to go see the wizard. Back to Glinda, she gets a freaking train to herself. I mean, there's a lot of gift giving and flattery that happens. Another thing that groomers can do is gradually introduce inappropriate elements into the relationship. Again, this is usually in grooming that is used for sexual purposes, so I couldn't really think of anything off the top of my head that applies to Elphaba or Glinda. And then, another distinct trait of grooming is using secrecy and shame to control the target. We see this a lot with Madame Morrible, just intentionally and constantly talking down to Glinda. She makes Glinda keep saying, she makes Glinda's feelings in relationship to Elphaba remain a secret. Like, it's a point of shame. She shouldn't be, friends with the Wicked Witch. Madame Morrible shames Glinda for using Elphaba's name and not calling her the Wicked Witch. Just a lot of derogatory talk towards Glinda, very much driving home the shame dynamic of, like, you need to do X, Y, and Z what I tell you, because if not, then you're a failure, and then you're a shame on, myself, and you're a stain on the wizard's record, yada, yada, yada. So, given all of these signs, it's pretty clear why Glinda was put in the position she was in. I think something people tend to forget is that in Act 1 of Wicked, Elphaba, Glinda, and Fiyero, Bach, Nessa, they're all children, they're all teenagers, so it's really not that surprising that just about all of them were as easy to manipulate as they were. And given these keystones of Glinda's pathology, I think we can kind of use it to examine some of the decisions that she made. First and foremost, let's look at Glinda during the Shiz years. She's not exactly a nice person, especially to Elphaba. Her kindness isn't real kindness, at least not at first. She has a role which is to be popular, be likable. She's a wealthy girl. People expect her to behave this way, including her mom, who instilled that in a very early age. Glinda, is more than happy to fulfill that role, because up until now, there hasn't been any consequence for fulfilling that role. But when she gets to Shiz for the first time, someone actually challenges Glinda in that role, and that person is Elphaba. Elphaba can see straight through Glinda and her intentions, so much so that she actively calls Glinda out almost as soon as she arrives at Shiz. And Elphaba won't be the only one to challenge Glinda's worldview and social standing. Glinda is denied a private suite, which she fully expects. She's denied special treatment by Madame Morrible. She's denied getting into sorcery classes, everything like that. She also isn't immediately accepted by Elphaba. These are all rejections that she's very much not used to, and for the first time, she's being faced with the fact that she isn't liked, and she isn't getting what she wants, which are things that have been instilled in her since she was a child. This helps fuel her distaste for Elphaba, where we get the whole loathing type of situation. And we can see Glinda projecting a lot of her frustrations on this new change in dynamic onto Elphaba. Glinda cannot fathom why someone like Elphaba, who is so openly detested by everybody else, is getting better treatment than her. And she can't understand why Elphaba, who isn't liked by anybody else, doesn't want to really be her friend so that she can gain social standing as well. Again, this goes back to Glinda's childhood. We also have to recognize that comparatively, Glinda is incredibly childish, while Elphaba is incredibly mature in a lot of ways. This is something that I touch on in Elphaba's respective podcast/YouTube episode. This puts them at odds as well. And Glinda hasn't really had to grow up or make adult decisions. She's been very coddled. Again, like I mentioned this in my Elphaba episode, but literally everything Glinda is used to is being turned upside down, and she doesn't really have the emotional capacity to handle that in a mature way. That's why we see her be so facetious and give Elphaba the iconic Wicked Witch hat. It's a petty and childish thing to do. It's mean, and it's the equivalent of middle school bullying. We also see this behavior with Glinda setting up Nessa and Bach. Instead of being mature and expressing that she isn't interested, Glinda does a very adolescent thing by pawning Bach off onto somebody else instead of just expressing how she actually feels. And part of this is because she has never really been in a position where she's going to say no or set boundaries or say, hey, I don't like you that way. She's just going to accept the attention. And instead of, expressing her feelings and making things more of a negative situation, she's going to find a way to manipulate the situation where she still ends up being the good guy and not, making people unhappy. She's still satisfying Bach's need of approval, but phrasing it in a way where it saves her from having to express what it is that she's feeling. And throughout the first act of Wicked, we see moments where this type of childish behavior continues, namely in Glinda's deep desire to be with Fiyero, stating, quote, "But I want him," at the train station. It's almost like a small tantrum. It comes across as very, very childish, like a little kid who's saying, but I really want the tractor at the store. Sometimes you can't get what you want. That said, we also see Glinda do a lot of growing up. because for the first time, she's confronted with the reality of her actions in a lot of these situations, especially seeing Elphaba at the Ozdust Ball. It's probably the first time she's actually been faced with the fact that by pleasing other people, going with the flow, and getting them to like her because they don't like Elphaba, it's not really what she wants. The Ozdust Ball is the first time Glinda breaks away from her people-pleasing role to the point that she actively ignores Fanny and Shen Shen, who are very upset with her. And this is a prime example of why people-pleasers don't break the cycle. Those who they hold in high regard, those they want to like them, will abandon them. That suddenly they are rejected and are unwanted. This is something that we see explicitly in this interaction. Again, this is something detrimental to Glinda. She was raised to expect and work for people to like her. So stepping out of that comfort zone is why the Ozdust scene is so powerful, because it's everything Glinda's afraid of happening and has been raised to avoid and has tried to avoid. And for a brief moment in time, Glinda and Elphaba are on the same playing field. They're both rejected by their peers. Something Elphaba is used to, something Glinda is not. However, Elphaba is being accepted by Glinda, who's somebody that objectively everybody likes, so they meet in the middle. It's two sides converging as one, and that's why it's such a powerful scene. And Glinda really struggles in that scene. You can see it for a second, because Fiyero kind of tries to dissuade her. Fanny and Shen Shen also start to dissuade her from going to Elphaba's aid, and she does anyways. So again, this is very poignant because it is everything that she's afraid of taking place, and yet she still goes to Elphaba anyways. I think another thing that's important to recognize is that a lot of people pleasers objectively know that their relationships are superficial. That at the surface level, the people they want to like them don't actually like them for who they are, but for what they can do for them, or this fake persona that they've put on. Glinda has likely never experienced true, genuine, well-intentioned kindness. So when Elphaba goes out of her way to include Glinda in sorcery lessons, Glinda knows this comes from a place of genuine care. Because what other motivation does Elphaba have for this other than being a good person? And this action alone subverts and puts into perspective Glinda's own relationships, because nobody else is going to do that for her. And it's why in Wicked for Good, Glinda says, quote, "And I've had so many friends, but only one that mattered." This also ties into Fiyero because, once again, it's a very superficial relationship. At the bare bones of it all, Glinda and Fiyero did love each other, but not the way either of them pretended to. And for good, both of them are trying desperately to make the other happy. And I think, and they both think that the other is succeeding in this, because at the end of the day, Glinda and Fiyero are two sides of the same coin. Their relationship was doomed to fail from the start. And when you think about it, without Elphaba, Glinda is in a massive state of emotional loneliness. We see Glinda be a true version of herself with Elphaba because she knows she doesn't have to do a bunch of the extra bullshit to make Elphaba like her. Elphaba doesn't care about any of that the way that other people do. And Glinda's able to step away from the role she's always been in because all these other people that aren't Elphaba expect her to be that way. Elphaba doesn't. Glinda doesn't have to pretend to be that way with her. She can just be whoever she wants, and part of that's because Elphaba has no prior context of who Glinda is as a person, the way that all of these other people do. We also see Glinda try to mediate repeatedly between Elphaba and the wizard in Act 1 and Act 2 because she falls back into those people-pleasing tendencies of wanting to make everybody happy. She wants to protect Elphaba and help Elphaba succeed, but she also doesn't want to turn her back on the wizard and Oz and Madame Morrible. She's supremely aware that doing so would also make her an enemy of the state, the way Elphaba is, and being an enemy of the state contradicts her entire upbringing. Her self-worth is tied directly to other people's loves. So I know a lot of people shit on Glinda for not going with Elphaba on the broom. In reality, a lot of people wouldn't. Glinda tried to leave with her in the balloon, and that didn't work, which is unfortunate. And by the time we get to the broomstick, shit has really hit the fan. Like, there's guards breaking into the building that they're in, and the gravity of the situation is very apparent. Glinda in that moment isn't brave enough to go with Elphaba, but that doesn't mean she doesn't care about Elphaba. She still begs the guards not to hurt her, she tries to make Elphaba stay warm with the cloak, etc. Like, she still has a heart, but at the end of the day, she can't subvert her long-held belief system, even for the sake of morals. And given this information, it makes it easier for the wizard and Morrible to manipulate Glinda. It's why Glinda goes along with the whole fascist regime thing. It doesn't make it right, and she definitely could have stopped at any point. But again, she's fulfilling her role as a people pleaser and getting people to like her by going along with the flow. It's one of those things where her intentions weren't bad. Her goal wasn't to screw everybody over, but there are still consequences for people's actions. And there are still consequences for her actions. For instance, we know Madame Morrible detests Glinda, always has. We know that she's trying desperately to get Glinda to stop humanizing Elphaba, but Glinda just cannot bring herself to do that. It's one of the few things she won't give up to the wizard and Morrible. And in Act 2, we see that Morrible and the wizard have given Glinda a new house, they've given her a bubble for transportation, she has a personal train, she has a wand, etc. They're plastering her face on everything, putting her in front of hundreds of adoring people. They know how she works, and they are manipulating the hell out of her. And that's the part that's so difficult for people to grasp. A lot of people point the finger at Glinda, saying she is the real villain, without recognizing the fact that she was manipulated into fulfilling this role by grown-ass adults that are giving her everything she's ever wanted. She even is set to marry Fiyero. But we as the audience can see that Glinda is deeply unhappy because, again, all of this is superficial. She's emotionally lonely. At the end of the day, she craves Elphaba's companionship because it was the only true companionship she actually had, which ironically is also the only effective antidote for Glinda's pathology. Elphaba cancels out the shit that Glinda's grown up believing. Elphaba negates the grooming and the people pleasing and the emotional loneliness. Together, they can't be as easily manipulated. And like I said, Glinda doesn't have to perform to get Elphaba to like her. And ironically, Glinda is now in a very adult role. She's stepped away from that childish nature because she's been forced into a very public position from the moment Act 1 ends. Remember, she was still a teenager at that point, and she's been forced to grow up almost overnight. It's not fun and games anymore, it's real life, and we can see her struggle to understand this and come to terms with this. And in the end, Glinda loses absolutely everything. And the sad thing is, people pleasers fear abandonment, but in her act of pleasing the public and bad people like Morrible and the Wizard, she loses Elphaba and Fiyero. She becomes completely alone. So by trying to prevent this by people pleasing, she inadvertently sets all of that in motion. And again, it's important to remember that while this is Glinda's fault, she was also used and abused, like I said, by two very powerful people, just like Elphaba was. But at the same time, it explains the quote, "Who could resist this?" discussion that happens between her and Fiyero. Someone like Glinda would have a very difficult time resisting the situation that she was in. Because, for once, she's loved by everybody, she's fulfilling the role established for her as a child by her own mother, and she's getting everything she's wanted, which has always been this fantasy world that she's built for herself. And that's the point of her character. She is tragic just like Elphaba. They are two halves of a whole. So yes, Glinda isn't a great person, but she spent a lot of for good trying to do what she felt was right by compromising with the wizard and Morrible for the sake of Elphaba. The unfortunate thing is that some people you just can't compromise with. And Glinda never intended to be bad or do bad things, but because she couldn't deconstruct her own tendencies and behaviors, she was weaponized and responsible for a lot of the tragedy in her own life. And the sad thing is, Glinda represents a vast majority of the population. So before you scream and throw pitchforks at her, take a moment to reflect. Would you have had an easy time rejecting the position she was in? Especially with the grooming and childhood she had. She's not meant to be a saint, but she's also not meant to be a villain either. She's meant to be one of us, and I think a lot of people fail to realize that. And if anything, she's a warning of what can happen if you subvert your moral beliefs for the sake of making other people happy. You have to find your own self-worth. And it can be very hard to do. Like I said, I myself am a people pleaser. And this isn't to give people pleasers like a bad name or anything, but it's just something really important to consider. And it's why at the end, with No One Mourns the Wicked, she says that the wicked's lives are lonely, because Glinda is reconciling the fact that she has been wicked up until this point, and that is why she is alone now. I think it's also important to note that Glinda changes. She does start doing genuinely good things, trying to make Oz a place that Elphaba would have been proud of. And I think too many people say, oh, I wish, so and so would change. I wish so and so would realize, that X, Y, and Z is wrong. And then when people finally do that, everybody's like, oh, well, too bad, so sad. Either we want people to grow and adapt and change, or we don't. We cannot have it both ways. And I think that's partially why Glinda is so relatable, is some people genuinely do not intend to do bad things. Sometimes they are just ignorant or they're arrogant. And at a certain point, there will come a time when they are forced to reconcile the fact that, oh crap, the choices that I made have led to the consequences in my own life. I need to reflect and make better choices. We have to respect the growth of people. It's okay to say, hey, I didn't agree with all of that bullshit you did before. That's fine. Nobody's saying that you have to just ignore that. But we should be encouraging people to make the proper choices, to move forward, to better society, to better themselves, instead of condemning them in the process. Because at the end of the day, nobody's going to want to learn or change if we just point the finger and mock them for it. So, overall, I hope this helped explain a little bit of why Glinda takes some of the action she does. Just like with Elphaba's episode, I did my best to articulate, my thoughts and feelings, and I hope I didn't get too kind of convoluted in what I was saying. Again, I genuinely love the characters of Wicked. This whole stage show has meant a lot to me since I was very, very young. And I love the characters wholeheartedly. Their nuances and pathologies are really great to look at and analyze. I think they are some very good fleshed out characters. Unfortunately, he kind of gets ignored a lot. He's not as fleshed out of a character, so his episode will probably be pretty short, but I will do my best because I still like him. Again, there's other things with Glinda that I would like to get into. Personally, I think she has a lot of comp het issues, but I want to keep this, kind of in the realm where no matter where you stand in as far as LGBTQ stuff goes, you can still enjoy this episode. I personally think that she is not straight, but that is my personal opinion. Take that as you will. Anywho, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. If you feel like it, please let me know what you think. Do you think that Glinda's arc reflected her childhood issues, her trauma, etc.? Do you think that people should be talking more about Morrible and the Wizard and their kind of role in things? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts, feelings, and opinions. And as always, please stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay psyched out.